Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into Europe after Trafalgar. Here's what you'll get in this episode, and why it matters right now. We'll see how one naval battle tipped the economic balance of a continent, how Britain converted taxes and credit into gunpowder and sail, how Napoleon tried to choke an island empire without meeting it at sea, and how everyday goods like sugar and cotton became weapons in a silent war. By the end, you'll see why prices can defy emperors, why paperwork can bite harder than cannon, and why the side with deeper capital markets often outlasts the side with larger armies. Let's set the board. It is 1805, and the Royal Navy has just won decisively at Trafalgar. What does that actually mean beyond the headlines? In practical terms, France cannot force a sea decision. Napoleon can dominate roads, rivers, and capitals on land, but the Channel remains a moving wall patrolled by British convoy systems and blue water squadrons. If you are the French emperor and the ocean has become a locked door, you do not keep slamming into it. You look for the hinges. You turn to the economy. Britain, for its part, is more than ships and songs. It is a fiscal military state, which is a fancy way of saying it can reliably turn taxes and long-term debt into war-fighting capacity without burning down its credit. Think of a modern credit card with a stellar limit and a trustworthy repayment record. Parliament levies broad-based taxes. The City of London underwrites funded debt. The Treasury then converts that credibility into copper for hulls, oak for masts, wages for sailors, and salted beef for Atlantic crossings. Logistics is not a side note here, it is the beating heart. A navy that can stay at sea year-round, with predictable victualling and pay, becomes a floating supply chain that protects your trade while harassing the other sides. France's power looks different. Enormous continental reach. Massed armies that can cross the Rhine or the Alps, impose terms in Vienna, Berlin, or Madrid. But to squeeze Britain, land power must somehow reach across water without a fleet. That is the core dilemma. So Napoleon pivots from breaking ships to breaking exchange. If you cannot sink British convoys, you try to starve British markets. Now widen the lens to the everyday economy. Continental Europe is not a closed autarkic system. By 1805 and 1806, the fabric of daily life is interlinked with British goods and finance. British textiles saturate wardrobes and workshops. Colonial commodities like sugar and coffee have become habits as much as luxuries. Credit and bills drawn on London quietly knit merchants from Hamburg to Amsterdam to Paris. When you target British trade, you are tugging at threads that run through kitchens, cafes, and counting houses all across the continent. Picture the map we are showing on the slide. Napoleonic Europe colored in bold blocks, the Royal Navy's reach traced as arcs across the Atlantic and the North Sea, down past Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean. Those arcs aren't just lines, they are ensured routes, convoy timetables, and lighthouse networks. Beneath that map, an infographic contrasts two foundations. On the British side, tax receipts, funded debt, and maritime logistics. On the French side, land revenue streams, requisitions, and continental administration. Different operating systems. Different failure modes. Here is the strategic consequence. After Trafalgar, a direct amphibious punch at Britain becomes fantasy. The feasible path is economic warfare, make British goods toxic in European ports, raise the costs for neutrals to touch British cargoes, and force substitution on the continent. If British cloth and colonial sugar become scarce or more expensive, then perhaps British revenue thins, perhaps credit tightens, perhaps the war chest runs dry. That is the theory. But theories have to pass through human incentives. Merchants calculate margins. Local officials juggle rules and realities. Consumers grumble when coffee vanishes or doubles in price. Every decree on paper will collide with the opportunity to profit at sea. Keep that tension in mind as we move forward, a maritime power funded by credible finance versus a continental empire trying to weaponize scarcity. The stage is set. Naval dominance has fixed the sea lanes, the next move will try to fix the markets. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, can a government command prices by command alone, especially across borders it cannot patrol perfectly? Or do prices find side doors and back alleys the moment the front gate is bolted? That question will echo through every policy choice from this point on. Your mental map for the rest of the story begins here. British sea control closes one path. Napoleon opens another, built on laws, licenses, and blockades. The real drama won't just be on battlefields. It will be in warehouses, insurance offices, prize courts, and the ledgers of families deciding whether to pay more for sugar or to switch to something less sweet. The guns have fired. Now the spreadsheets take the field. Ready to follow the money, the the rules, and the loopholes? Let's step into the legal architecture that tries to make scarcity a weapon. Let's build the legal machine that tried to turn paper into power. 3 moves, fast and sharp. First, the Berlin Decree in November 1806. Napoleon declares the British Isles under blockade and orders continental ports closed to British goods. On paper, that sounds simple. In practice, it tries to make British commerce radioactive across Europe. If it smells like British origin, keep it out. The goal is not to meet the Royal Navy at sea. The goal is to forbid the market from breathing British air. Second, London answers with the Orders in Council of 1807. If Napoleon wants to close ports, Britain will tax the very act of avoiding Britain. The orders say that neutral ships trading with Europe must first call at a British port, get inspected, buy a license, pay fees, then proceed. It is a clever move, fold neutrality into the British legal system and turn access into a revenue stream and an information net. If you pass through the toll booth, you're safer. If you don't, you risk being treated as helping the enemy. Third, Napoleon escalates with the Milan Decree in December 1807. If a ship submits to British search, if it accepts the ritual of inspection and license, France will treat that ship as compromised and subject it to capture and condemnation. Now the trap is symmetrical. Britain punishes those who avoid British control. France punishes those who accept British control. Where does that leave a neutral captain? Picture the slide's timeline: Berlin, then orders, then Milan, like 3 dominoes falling in quick sequence. Next to it, imagine the flowchart of a neutral voyage. A merchant loads cargo. Decision point 1, sail straight to a continental port and risk British interception at sea. Decision point 2, detour to a British port, accept search and fees, then continue and risk French seizure for having done so. Every branch carries a different combination of delay, paperwork, and danger. And time is money on a wooden ship. What do these rules do economically? They raise transaction costs like a moving, unpredictable tax. There's the risk premium for being stopped, the insurance surcharge for sailing under a cloud of legal uncertainty, the cost of licenses, the time lost waiting out inspections or weather in a port you never wanted to visit. Even if nothing goes wrong, the mere possibility changes behavior. Captains adjust routes. Merchants hedge inventories. Prices start to carry a legal shadow. Now for the incentives. When one side writes a rule, the other side writes a workaround. Britain's licensing system creates a queue where a clever trader can buy permission and, effectively, buy information. France's retaliation creates a reason to disguise where you've been and what you've carried. Both sides raise the official cost of compliance, and at the same time, both sides create profitable grey areas. Think about the arbitrage. If a cargo that clears British paperwork can fetch a premium on the continent because others are too scared or too slow, someone will try it. If a ship that avoids British ports entirely can arrive with goods that are suddenly scarce, someone else will try that too. Every added barrier opens a side door for those willing to pay the risk-adjusted price. Here's a human way to see it. You're a neutral captain in 1807, carrying coffee and cotton. Option 1, stop in a British port, present your papers, pay the license, sail on, and hope a French official doesn't decide your compliance is a confession. Option 2, skip Britain, shave time, but increase your chance of British interception and a long, expensive legal fight. Either way, you call your insurer and your banker, and their questions turn into your costs. Can you prove origin? Do you have a license number? How long will you be off schedule? None of these are cannon shots, but they sting the balance sheet. Notice something subtle on the slide's flowchart. At each decision node, there isn't just a yes or no. There's a price attached to yes, and a different price attached to no. That price isn't fixed. It moves with weather, patrol density, rumor, policy tweaks, and the appetite of officials. That variability is what makes the system leak. Traders don't need perfect certainty. They need a margin that justifies the gamble. So the legal architecture is clear. Berlin tries to seal the continent. The orders try to make Britain the compulsory checkpoint. Milan tries to punish anyone who accepts that checkpoint. The combined effect is to turn the sea into a maze of rules where every path has a toll, and every toll creates a shadow path with a higher reward. That is the duel, decree against order, order against decree, with neutral commerce caught in the crossfire and calculating all the while. Hold that structure in your mind. Rules raise costs. Costs reshape routes. Routes create opportunities. And opportunities invite people who are very, very good at finding the edges of law. We'll see how those edges show up in prices next. Let's turn the rules into numbers you can feel in your pocket. A blockade does not simply say stop. It says pay. It acts like a variable trade tax made up of several layers stacked on top of each other: the risk you might be stopped, the delay if you are, the chance of seizure, and the higher insurance premium your underwriter demands to sleep at night. Add them together and you get a single idea: the risk-adjusted landed cost. Picture a barrel of sugar on a quay. Before the decrees and orders, the cost is straightforward: by price at origin, freight, a predictable insurance premium, port fees, and a modest margin. After the rules duel, the spreadsheet starts growing tentacles. There is a surcharge for sailing through patrolled waters. There is expected loss from potential seizure, which your insurer will price even if you pretend not to. There is the time cost of detouring to an extra port just to show your papers, and the carrying cost of money tied up in cargo while you wait. Even if you make it through untouched, each of those probabilities gets multiplied by real money. What happens on the consumer side when landed cost rises unpredictably? Prices begin to miscommunicate. London quotes one number for sugar, coffee, cotton, and timber. Hamburg and Amsterdam quote another. Paris quotes a third. The lines that used to move together now pull apart like threads under stress. You start to see widening spreads, not because the good changed, but because the path between buyer and seller changed. Price transmission phrase. Let's make that concrete. Sugar and coffee, those colonial staples, become the perfect barometers. If moving them into the continent now carries higher risk and delay, their prices climb in Hamburg and Paris faster than in London. The spread is not a curiosity. It is a signal that the market is paying for risk. Cotton shows it too. A mill owner in a continental town opens the ledger and sees a higher variable cost for raw fiber. That squeezes margins or pushes up the price of cloth. Either way, it travels from dock to workshop to household. But markets are not statues. They substitute. When cane sugar grows costly or unreliable, chemists and administrators start looking hard at alternatives. Enter beet sugar. It isn't romance that puts beet fields under cultivation, it is arithmetic. If you can process beets domestically and dodge the maritime risk tax, you can narrow the spread. Does beet match cane in quality at first? Not quite. But when rules change relative prices, people change recipes, habits, and investments. That is substitution. You see similar moves in textiles and cordage. Linen and hemp, the old standbys, reclaim ground where cotton becomes dear or erratic. Not because fashion suddenly changed, but because the inputs and their risk pricing did. Households and workshops adapt at the margin. A shirt that might have been cotton becomes linen. A rope that might have been imported fiber leans back on local hemp. Each tiny choice is a vote counted by prices. Now pivot to timber. Britain's own industry has to adapt too. If certain Baltic routes are snarled or made costlier by policy and patrols, British buyers and shipwrights reweight their sourcing, turning more to North America and to safer Baltic corridors when possible. That reorientation is not ideological, it is logistical. Timber is heavy, bulky, and time-sensitive for shipbuilding cycles. Stretch the voyage or risk the cargo and you change the math for the yard that needs masts in a given quarter. Britain's empire gives it options. The blockade's tax nudges which option is chosen. Let's unpack the risk-adjusted landed cost one layer at a time so the mechanics stick. Start with base cost at origin. Add freight. Add the insurance premium that now includes a probability of interception times the expected loss if condemned. Add the expected waiting days at a compulsory port call, multiplied by the daily carrying cost of capital and spoilage when applicable. Add informal payments where officials are hungry for fees or bribes. Every term is either a number or a probability. None of them are zero anymore. If you plotted these effects, the slide's line charts would show it: London's price series wobbling with supply and demand, and across the water, Hamburg or Paris climbing more steeply at moments when enforcement tightens or rumors spike. The gap widens, narrows, widens again. Those oscillations are not noise, they are policy breathing through the market. Insurance markets echo it too. Underwriters raise or lower rates as convoy protection stiffens or slackens, as winter ice thins patrols, as a decree gets clarified or quietly ignored. Each tweak translates into pennies on the pound for a barrel, then into shillings at the shop counter. There is a deeper lesson tucked in here. A blockade's success is not measured only in how many ships are stopped. It is measured in how much persistent price dispersion it can create without prompting workarounds that erase it. If spreads stay wide and stable, the blockade bites. If spreads widen and then invite smuggling that collapses them, the policy is paying smugglers as much as it is taxing the enemy. That interplay is the heartbeat of this story. So, when you hear about sugar switching to beet, linen nudging aside cotton, or British timber flows tilting toward Canada and safe Baltic channels, understand those not as trivia, but as the market mapping the obstacle course. Every substitution is a contour line around a policy mountain. Every spread is a windsock showing which way the incentives are blowing. Hold that image of moving, risk-weighted costs and fraying price transmission. Because where there are spreads, there are profits. And where there are profits, there are people ready to slip through the grey zones between decree and order. Where there are price gaps, there are entrepreneurs with fast boats and creative paperwork. Enforcement births workarounds like pressure births cracks, and in the age of sail those cracks ran along coasts, sandbars, river mouths, and ledger lines. Start with the map in your head. North Sea islands like Heligoland sitting like stepping stones just off the continental coast. A cutter can slip behind them, unload at night, and melt back into the chop before dawn. The Baltic offers a beaded chain of small ports and inlets where a cargo can be broken down, relabeled, or quietly repacked into river barges. The Adriatic has coves and low islands where a patrol ship's draft keeps it honest while shallow craft dance inshore. And the Iberian coastline, long and bite-marked with estuaries, becomes a maze that rewards local knowledge over imperial doctrine. Add rivers like the Elbe and the Weser. They are not just blue lines on a map, they are conveyor belts running inland. If a bale or a barrel reaches the river, it reaches the market. Now add the second layer, the licensing paradox. Both Britain and France sell permission slips. Britain issues licenses that allow neutral or even enemy-linked merchants to move specified goods under controlled terms. France issues its own licenses, sometimes to import or export items the decrees supposedly ban, often with conditions and fees that fill state coffers. On the surface, each license is an exception designed to serve policy goals or alleviate shortages. In reality, the trade becomes a patchwork quilt of officially sanctioned leaks. The state earns revenue and gathers information, but every exception creates a lane that clever traders can widen with practice. Think about how a merchant exploits this. You purchase a British license that says your neutral vessel may carry a certain list of goods from point A to point B. You then negotiate a French license that carves out a mirrored allowance at the destination. Between the two, you have a corridor stitched from paperwork. Officials can still stop you, but the presence of stamps, signatures, and fees paid changes the conversation. It turns a total prohibition into a taxable negotiation. The policy has not vanished. It has become a price. Meanwhile, local officials live in the grey. A customs officer is paid to enforce the rule. A mayor is responsible for employment and bread prices. A military governor needs supplies for garrisons. The merchant offers a license, a plausible story, and maybe a contribution to local funds. The official faces mixed incentives, follow the decree to the letter and choke the town, or interpret flexibly and keep people working while raising a little revenue. Multiply that dilemma across hundreds of ports and checkpoints, and the clean lines on the decree dissolve into a watercolor of compromises. Heligoland deserves a closer look because it captures the whole ecology in miniature. It functions as a free port and a sorting room. Cargoes arrive in bulk, are subdivided, repackaged, and reflagged, then sent in smaller, faster boats to the continental shore. The short dash lowers exposure time to patrols. The new papers reduce the chance that a cargo traces back to a forbidden origin. And because Heligoland becomes known as a hub, the price of space in its warehouses and the fees for local fixers become part of the risk-adjusted cost. Smuggling here is not just a nighttime chase, it is a supply chain with invoices. Follow a single shipment to see how incentives stack. A trader buys coffee at source, uses a neutral flag, and sails to a staging port. There, the cargo is split. Half will try for a license route and pass through a British checkpoint to secure paperwork and insurance cover. Half will go the fast way, hugging shoals and slipping into a river mouth on a moonless night. If the licensed half arrives, it fetches a good price and builds a reputation for reliability with certain buyers. If the grey half arrives, it fetches a higher price because it avoided tolls and delays. If one half is seized, the other half's profit can still carry the voyage. This is portfolio thinking applied to sail and saltwater. Notice how licensing and smuggling do not cancel each other out. They complement each other. Licenses create predictable lanes that carry volume. Smuggling exploits the remaining spreads where licenses do not reach or where paperwork is too slow. Together, they keep markets supplied enough to blunt the sharpest edges of scarcity, but not enough to erase the profits that keep the machine running. As long as the spread between a risky route and a safe route is bigger than the expected penalty, the grey zones breathe. And yes, there is corruption, but it is not cartoonish. It is structured by need. A customs farmer, whose income depends on collected dues, may be tempted to interpret rules in ways that maximize receipts rather than purity. A town that depends on a textile workshop will quietly tolerate the entry of forbidden cotton if it keeps looms humming and wages flowing. A regional commander may issue a local order that bends the decree to ensure his supply lines don't snap. These decisions are not made in darkness alone. They are rational responses to incentives set from above. All of this tells you something uncomfortable about centralized control over sprawling markets. The more finely you tune the rules to close every loophole, the more you raise the reward for the loophole that remains. The tighter you grip, the more valuable the slip becomes. That does not mean enforcement is impossible. It means enforcement creates its own economy, with its own prices, professions, and politics. So, smugglers and licenses are not side characters. They are the bloodstream that carries goods through a body that official policy tried to constrict. They feed inland markets via rivers. They use islands as lungs. They run on information, on reputation, and on the quiet cooperation of people whose jobs and meals depend on trade moving at least a little. Keep that living map in your mind. Where the decree draws a line, a boat draws a dotted one just offshore. Where a port official stamps a license, a merchant calculates how to arbitrage the gap it leaves. The grey zone is not a place. It is a system that grows wherever profits outrun penalties. When rules hit markets, they do not land evenly. They land like hail, some roofs crack, others get a free wash. Let's follow where the hailstones fall and who learns to sell umbrellas. Start with continental manufacturers. In the short run, the blockade functions like a protective wall against British textiles. Those famously cheap and varied British cotton stop flowing freely, and suddenly a Leon silk weaver, a Saxon linen mill, or a Rhineland cotton printer finds breathing room. Orders pick up. Workshops hum. Apprentices get hired. That sounds like victory, but listen closely to the rattle under the floorboards. The quality and variety gap does not vanish overnight. British spinning and weaving had years of compound learning behind them and machines, standards, and supply chains. Continental producers can sell more because the rival is fenced out, not because they have fully caught up. That means consumers pay more for fewer options, and producers face a comfort trap. Protected margins today can dull the urgency to innovate for tomorrow. Now shift to the merchants in colonial goods, sugar, coffee, dyes, spices. For them, scarcity is a double-edged sword with a golden handle. If you can source, route, and insure cargo through the maze, you earn arbitrage profits that would have looked mythical in peacetime. A broker with good information and good nerve can turn the price spread between London and Hamburg into a ladder of silver. But those profits have a fuse. Each time policy tightens, risk spikes. Each time a back door opens, competition rushes in and trims the margin. The winners here are the nimble, the well-connected, and the lucky. Neutral carriers are a story in phases. Early on, American, Danish, and Swedish flags can move goods where British and French flags would trigger seizure. Neutral keels earn handsome freights as the rules duel makes them temporarily precious. But neutrality is not a magic cloak, it is a status that politics can revoke. As diplomatic winds shift and navies expand prize lists, the neutral premium shrinks or vanishes. The winners are those who cashed in before the storm line moved, and those who diversified routes and papers quickly enough to survive when it did. Insurance and freight do something counterintuitive. Risk is a tax on trade, but it is also income for those who price it correctly. Underwriters who can model patrol density, seasonal weather, and legal quirks turn fear into a rate sheet. Shipowners with stout hulls and disciplined crews command higher freights for dangerous legs. A convoy-protected run with predictable schedules might earn less per ton than a shadowy dash to a smuggler's inlet, but the convoy scales. The result is a two-track market, safe volume at modest margins, and risky volume at eye-watering margins. Both thrive as long as spreads persist. Turn to Britain's adjustments. Timber is the backbone of ships and structures, and the Baltic had been a dependable source. When the blockade and war risk squeeze those channels, Britain leans harder on Canada and on any Baltic route that remains viable under protection. That is not just substitution, it is a shift in imperial investment. Ports adapt to receive North American timber more efficiently. Contracts and credit terms evolve to reflect longer voyages and different seasonal windows. Every adaptation ratchets a bit more of Britain's economy toward places that the blockade cannot easily touch. Sugar and cotton show the same British reorientation. If continental Europe becomes a difficult customer, Britain cultivates demand and supply chains across the West Indies and India with renewed intensity. Mills do not sit idle waiting for perfect bales, they tweak blends and rely on the Navy to shepherd convoys. The empire proves most valuable not as a trophy cabinet but as an option set. When one door shuts, another opens, not because of pure luck, but because transport, insurance, and credit are coordinated by institutions that believe their bills will be paid. On the continent, the losers are more diffuse and more political. Consumers of colonial goods see their real incomes shaved by higher prices and erratic availability. Bakers, brewers, dyers, and tanners, any trade that relies on imported inputs, feel the grit in their gears. A dye shortage changes cloth colors available for sale. A coffee shortage changes the rhythm of cafes and meetings where business is done. These are not battlefield losses, but they are morale and productivity losses that accumulate like sand in a clock. There is also a silent loser in the administrative ledger, state capacity. The army of inspectors, customs men, and local officials pulled into the blockade effort are no longer focusing on building roads, streamlining courts, or improving tax fairness. Instead, they chase merchants and paperwork. That creates rents. Where a stamp or a signature can unlock a cargo's value, the stamp acquires a market price. The winners are the middlemen who learn the price of every signature and the rhythm of every patrol. The losers are the rule followers stranded in lines that the well-connected breeze past. Look again at the slide Sankey diagram. Before the war, thick bands carry timber from the Baltic, cotton and sugar from the Atlantic, textiles from Britain into continental markets. Under the blockade, those bands narrow, split, and snake through odd channels. Some bands bend toward Canada. Some thicken around Heligoland and other staging points. Others fragment into dotted lines that represent licensed exceptions and clandestine runs. That visual is the economy learning to route around pressure while charging a toll at every bend. If we reduced this to a simple ledger, it might look like this. Short-run protection props up certain continental manufacturers, but at the cost of consumer choice and long-run competitiveness unless they invest. Arbitrageurs, insurers, and adaptable carriers book profits as long as they can read the rules faster than the enforcers. British sectors tied to empire and finance, convoys, shipyards, insurers, colonial merchants, grow more central to the war economy. Meanwhile, households across the continent pay a quiet tax in dearer groceries and thinner variety, and local authorities pay in credibility as people learn that the fastest way through a rule is not obedience but payment. One more adjustment is easy to miss. Information becomes a commodity with its own price. Knowing when a decree will be strictly enforced or quietly waived for a week can be worth more than a faster ship. Traders invest in rumor networks, in friendly clerks, in coded correspondence, and in timely newspapers. The winners are those who treat knowledge like cargo. The losers are those who assume the last month's rule will behave the same way next month. So, winners, losers, adjustments. None of it is random. The blockade minted temporary industrial shields, permanent habits of substitution, and a thriving ecosystem of risk pricing. It narrowed some channels and deepened others. It rewarded those with options, imperial ports, flexible capital, good information, and punished those without. Keep this distributional map in your head as we head south to Iberia. When ports reopen even a little, when supply lines flicker back to life under British protection, the winners and losers reshuffle again. Money moves. So do armies. And so do markets that have learned the value of a loophole. When politics breaks the lock on a port, markets rush in like air into a vacuum. The Peninsular War turns Iberia into exactly that kind of pressure chamber, and in the noise of battle you can hear the creak of customs gates reopening. Set the scene. It is 1808. Napoleon's move into Spain and Portugal sparks revolt, and Britain steps onto the peninsula not merely with regiments, but with ships, warehouses, credit, and an appetite to pry open Atlantic gateways. Lisbon and Cadiz become more than dots on a map. They become funnels, carrying legal and semi-legal trade back into Europe's bloodstream. Why these ports? Because they face the Atlantic, where British naval protection can shield convoys, and because they sit at the mouth of trade routes that stretch inland through old commercial arteries. When a convoy moors in Lisbon, it does not stop at the dock. Goods move onto carts, into river boats, and up roads that armies and smugglers both know by heart. Now consider guerrilla warfare, not just as a military tactic, but as an economic solvent. Small bands disrupt French communications and threaten detachments. That is bad for occupation forces. It is also bad for centralized customs enforcement. A patrol that fears ambush is a patrol that inspects less, or inspects quickly. A tax office that cannot rely on safe couriers becomes an office that hoards local receipts or looks the other way to keep peace. Local autonomy grows in the cracks. Towns and provinces improvise supply, shelter, and markets. When the center is focused on survival, the periphery renegotiates the rules by practice rather than proclamation. Military logistics amplify the effect. An army marches on food, fodder, salt, cloth, and powder. The moment British forces establish depots in Portugal or along the Spanish coast, a parallel economy forms around them. Contractors bid to deliver grain and meat. Teamsters get hired. Bakers fire up ovens. And because soldiers are human, not machines, money flows outward for everything from boots to coffee. Some of it is paid above board. Some of it spills into black markets. The line between legal, tolerated, and forbidden blurs wherever the need is urgent and the pay is good. Enter the Golden Cavalry of St. George. That is the nickname for British subsidies, paid in hard coin and credible promises, to keep allies in the fight. Think about what London's credit system accomplishes here. With funded debt and a trusted currency, Britain can send money that spends at full face value. Those subsidies do more than buy gunpowder. They stabilize local exchange, allow allied governments to pay soldiers on time, and keep suppliers willing to extend credit next week because last week's bill cleared. In a world where late pay means empty shelves, timely coin is a weapon as sharp as a bayonet. Look at the slide's map of Iberian supply lines. You will see blue arrows inbound to Lisbon and Cadiz, then branching inland toward British and Allied positions. That is not just a military map. It is a trade gradient. Every mile past the port, prices drift as risk and transport costs accumulate. Goods move along these arteries in multiple layers. Official convoys carry uniforms and powder. Licensed merchants follow with textiles, tools, and colonial groceries. Shadow caravans trail behind, filling gaps and skirting checkpoints. Each layer reads the same incentives, but each accepts a different level of risk for a different reward. This reopening of Atlantic gateways does something subtle to the continental system. It proves that blockade is not a binary. You can declare a continent closed. But the moment a few ports operate under naval protection and friendly administration, the word closed becomes a negotiation. Portuguese warehouses stocked under British convoy become reservoirs that gravity pulls into the interior. Cadiz becomes a marketplace where paper rules from Paris have less weight than the coin on the table. And once commerce is flowing, the habit of buying and selling finds friends quickly. Revenue farms awaken. Dock workers get paid. City councils rediscover the ease of balancing accounts when trade returns. Guerrilla economics, then, is not just smuggling with muskets. It is the total effect of local power asserting itself against distant, brittle control. A village that feeds a British column today expects cloth to arrive next month. A provincial junta that keeps roads safe for Allied wagons quietly asks for consideration in licenses, exemptions, and purchases. These bargaining chips add up. They pry open not just gates, but priorities. An occupying official who cannot guarantee security loses leverage to insist on customs purity. A British quartermaster who can pay promptly gains leverage to set terms that tilt markets. The human side makes it vivid. Imagine a merchant in Lisbon watching a convoy appear on the horizon. The harbour wakes. Cranes swing. Warehouses unlock. He has buyers upcountry hungry for coffee, sugar, and cloth. He also has a cousin in Cadiz who says demand is explosive as refugees, armies, and administrators jostle with cash. He splits the shipment. Part goes north under contract to the army because payment is certain and relations are valuable. Part goes to Cadiz to catch the rising price. The rest trickles into private orders destined for inland towns where French control feels strong on paper and thin on patrol. That portfolio of destinations is guerrilla economics in miniature. Diversify routes, diversify legal status, diversify buyers. Step back and see the pattern. The Peninsular War weakened centralized enforcement by forcing it to fight on two fronts, military and administrative. British naval presence strengthens the Atlantic side door. Subsidies turn promises into purchasing power. Local actors, from mayors to muleteers, rediscover their agency and price it accordingly. The net effect is that Iberia becomes a pressure valve for the blockade, not in a single dramatic breach, but in 1,000 transactions that add up to a reopened artery. Keep that artery in mind as we move on. When a coalition hinges on keeping ports sealed and allies disciplined, what happens when a major ally rethinks its interests and begins to reopen the market from within? That question will carry us east, to a country with vast forests and a long memory of trade. Sometimes a coalition breaks not with a shout, but with a tariff. Russia's term between 1810 and 1812 is a masterclass in how domestic incentives can quietly soar through the beams of a grand design. Start with the decree at the end of 1810. On paper, it is a protective tariff that raises walls around Russian markets. In practice, it is a signal flare. Russia is recalibrating. Instead of enforcing a hard seal against British-linked trade, St. Petersburg begins selectively reopening channels to neutrals and, through licensing untolerated intermediaries, to British goods themselves. The language is fiscal and industrial, the effect commercial and geopolitical. A tariff can be many things at once: revenue source, bargaining chip, and polite way of saying our priorities have shifted. Why shift now? Walk the incentives. Russia's nobility and merchant houses are not abstract patriots, they are owners of forests, fields, ships, and stockpiles. Timber, hemp, tar, and grain want buyers. British markets and British credit have long provided that outlet. If you are a Russian exporter holding hemp for rigging or timber for masts, a sealed Continental System is not a strategy, it is a warehouse bill. If you are a merchant lining up grain shipments, the difference between a British connected buyer with reliable payment and a theoretical customer behind a blockade is the difference between profit and risk of ruin. The press of inventory becomes a political argument. Flip the ledger to imports. British manufacturers do not only clothe fashion, they clothe farms and workshops with tools, hardware, and textiles. The demand is not just for luxury. It is for reliability, standard sizes, predictable quality, and the credit terms that accompany them. If British goods or British pattern goods can seep back in, even via neutral flags and licenses, Russian buyers can plan, price, and promise. This is not nostalgia for old trade routes. It is the daily arithmetic of a vast economy that stretches from Baltic ports to inland towns. Licensing becomes the hinge. A license is a small door cut into a large wall. Russia begins to issue them in ways that favor practical commerce over doctrinal purity. Neutrals get clearer paths. Certain categories of goods receive toleration under specified conditions. Customs men who understand what the decree intends and what the economy needs read those licenses as a green light to move goods that keep livelihoods intact. The result is not a thunderclap reopening. It is a steady thrum of traffic that grows loud enough to be heard in Paris. This is where the friction with Napoleon becomes unavoidable. The Continental System is supposed to be a chorus sung in unison. Russia's new melody is syncopated. From the emperor's vantage point, selective openness looks like defection wrapped in legalisms. From Russia's vantage point, it looks like sanity: preserve domestic revenues, keep exporters solvent, and prevent shortages that would push prices and tempers upward. It is easier to police a coastline on a map than to police incentives across thousands of versts. The timeline on the slide shows the acceleration. Policy shift at the end of 1810. Trade with British-linked networks begins to revive through neutrals and licenses in 1811. By 1812, the economic disagreement has ripened into a political crisis. The decision calculus in Paris tilts toward coercion. If a key ally will not keep the wall sealed, perhaps force will restore discipline. But notice what is driving the confrontation from the Russian side. It is not flamboyant betrayal. It is a domestic balance sheet that refuses to align with a continental doctrine. Take one concrete example: hemp. The Royal Navy's rigging is a hungry machine, and Russia's fields are among its traditional feeders. A season's harvest sitting idle punishes landowners and laborious alike. A license that moves that hemp to market, directly or indirectly, is not just a loophole. It is the difference between wages paid and wages withheld, rents collected and arrears piling up. As these small decisions multiply, they create a political reality that no decree can dissolve. The economy is voting with its wagons. Now imagine the conversations in Russian ports like Riga or St. Petersburg. Consular offices whisper that certain cargoes can pass. Merchants compare notes on which neutral flags draw fewer questions at which customs posts. Credit men observe that bills linked to London clear faster and at better rates. Each transaction is a data point. Together, they form a map of a trading nation feeling its way back toward the networks that make sense for it. By the time you reach the edge of 1812, the logic is brittle. A system that demands perfect compliance is confronting a state that has shifted to qualified compliance. The rift is not only legal, it is economic. Russia's internal incentives reward a reopening. Napoleon's strategy punishes it. When strategy collides with a partner's survival math, negotiation narrows and the shadow of force lengthens. Hold that chain in your mind. Protective tariff as signal. Licenses as lubrication. Export seeking oxygen. Import seeking reliability. Credit seeking credibility. Each is a strand tugging Russia away from the uniformity the Continental System requires. The coalition phrase not because diplomats forgot to agree, but because prices and payments remembered where they belonged. Time for the core question everyone argues about over coffee and footnotes: did the Continental System actually cripple Britain? Short answer, no. Longer answer, Britain bent, rebalanced, and kept paying its bills while still sending fleets to sea. Let's unpack how that was possible, step by step, in the plainest language. Begin with the war chest. Britain does not fund this war out of a tip jar. It draws on a broad tax base and a deep market for long-term debt. Income tax, excises on everyday items, and customs at the ports, none of these are charming, but together they create reliable cash flow. Reliable is the key word. When Parliament says a shilling will be collected, investors believe the shilling will show up. That credibility is not sentimental. It is collateral for borrowing at scale. Now turn to the city where credibility turns into coin, the market for government debt. Consols, perpetual bonds, trade every day, and their yield is the thermometer in the nation's financial mouth. If investors feared collapse, the yield would spike to fever levels and the Treasury would be stuck paying ruinous interest. Instead, it stays in a range that is painful but financeable. In other words, the price of funding a world war rises, but it stays within the bounds of what a functioning tax state can service. That alone tells you the blockade did not sever Britain's financial arteries. What about the banking system under stress? Remember, the Bank of England is operating through a suspension of cash payments, notes remain convertible in principle, gold convertibility is paused, yet everyday transactions continue, bills clear, and the Navy's payroll reaches the ships. That is not magic. It is institutional trust layered over practical management. The bank expands and contracts accommodation as needed, while the government's tax and debt machinery keeps a floor under confidence. If you are looking for a collapse, you do not find it in the bill-broking rooms or at the Navy pay offices. You find queues, grumbles, tighter terms, but not a run off the cliff. Exports next. Did they fall? Yes. Did they die? No. They reallocate. If the continent snarls, British merchants push harder into markets that are reachable and protected, colonies, neutral partners while they remain neutral, and any European port pried open by diplomacy or war. The product mix shifts, the destinations shift, and the timing of sailings adjusts to convoy schedules. The number to keep in mind is not a perfect index. It is the pattern: dip, adapt, resume. The line on the slide that matters is the one that climbs again once new routes and buyers settle in. Naval protection is the quiet multiplier humming in the background. Convoys are not glamorous, but they are the scaffolding that lets trade cross dangerous water with predictable loss rates. A merchant can insure a voyage if the insurer can price the risk, the insurer can price the risk if the Admiralty publishes routes and sticks to them. That triangle, Navy, insurer, merchant, keeps cargo moving even when the legal weather is foul. It is not lawless. It is disciplined. And discipline pays. Insurance markets deserve their own minute on stage. Underwriters at the coffee houses are not guessing. They are updating. Patrol patterns, seasonality, decree enforcement, ice and storms, rumors of a new order, each input budges the premium up or down. You could get angry about higher rates, but those rates are the reason a voyage still pencils out. They translate uncertainty into a known cost you can plan around. When the policy changes and the spread narrows, premiums ease. When it tightens, they rise. Either way, the ship sails because the math is explicit. Back to the Treasury ledger. Revenues rise, expenditures rise, and debt service rises with them, but they move in a rhythm that a mature financial system can handle. The new income tax does heavy lifting, excises deliver steady drips, customs keep chiming, and borrowing bridges the gap. Investors keep showing up to lend because the state keeps showing up to collect and to pay. That is the loop that makes a long war sustainable. Break the loop, and you spiral. Britain does not break it. What about prices and the paper pound? Inflationary pressure exists, war is never price neutral, but the system does not spin out. Why? Because credible taxation and borrowing siphon demand in one place while targeted spending releases it in another, and the bank's note issue expands in step with the economy's real ability to produce and pay. Imperfect, yes. Uncontrolled, no. You feel the strain at the shop counter. You do not feel the floor give way beneath your feet. If we stand back and read the whole picture like a ship's wake, it looks like this. The blockade pushes Britain to reroute trade, to harden convoy discipline, to lean on insurance as a shock absorber, and to pull harder on the levers of funded debt and taxation. Each lever creaks, but none snaps. Meanwhile, the Navy continues to contest and protect the sea lanes, which means cargo still moves, wages still get paid, and the city still clears its bills. A crisis that should have starved an island instead forced it to flex the very muscles it had spent decades building. So did the Continental System cripple Britain? No. It wounded, it irritated, it redirected, and it raised the bill. But the structure held credible finance, adaptive trade, and organized naval protection. If you want to see the policy bite, look not at Britain's balance sheet, but across the water, where scarcity, corruption rents, and administrative fatigue start to gnaw at the economies meant to enforce the blockade. If you really want to measure the Continental System, don't start with the Emperor's proclamations or the Admiral's reports. Start with a shopping list. When colonial goods go scarce and inputs arrive late, the first casualties are quiet, family budgets, shop inventories, workshop schedules. That is where the blockade levies its most human tax. Begin with the basket: sugar, coffee, cocoa, spices, dyestuffs, and the textiles that make life comfortable. When the risk-adjusted landed cost climbs, prices rise on the continent, and they do not always rise smoothly. They jerk upward with each enforcement sweep, sink slightly when a smuggling corridor runs hot, then jump again when patrols return or a rumor scares underwriters. Households experience this as uncertainty. The grocer's price board keeps changing. A pound of sugar becomes a treat instead of a staple. Coffee becomes weaker or substituted with chicory. Those are not just taste adjustments. They are signals that real income has slipped. Now widen the lens to proto-industry. A dyer needs indigo or cochineal, a brewer needs reliable sugar sources for certain processes, a leatherworker needs imported oils or bark substitutes, a printer needs fine paper stock and alum, a metalworker needs high-grade bar or a special alloying input that usually arrives by ship. When the price of a single imported input rises or its delivery time becomes unpredictable, an entire workshop's economics warp. Production schedules lengthen. Quality control gets harder. Contracts are missed. Workers lose hours. The blockade's cost is not only what you pay more for. It is also the value of what you cannot produce on time. Forced substitution sounds clever in policy memos. On the ground it feels like misallocation. Beet sugar can stand in for cane, but only after capital is sunk into processing, agronomy is tweaked, and know-how is built. Linen and hemp can stand in for cotton, but not at the same quality or consumer preference in every use. Local inputs keep some factories alive, yet the relative prices that summon those inputs are distorted by decree, not discovery. That kind of investment often sticks even after the policy changes, leaving a trail of stranded capacity or second-best practices that linger because people try to amortize sunk costs rather than admit the experiment was a policy artifact. Corruption rents, meanwhile, are not a side effect. They become a second currency. Every checkpoint and stamp that can raise a cargo's value also creates a market for access. A customs officer who controls a seal controls a spread. A military governor who allocates exemptions allocates profits. A licensed broker who can predict the next tweak in enforcement sells that knowledge at a premium. None of these actors need to be villains. The system pays them to turn friction into income. And the more the center tightens, the more those rents grow because the value of a clean passage rises with the penalty for being caught. State capacity gets diverted into policing trade instead of building prosperity. Imagine the ledger of a prefect who must assign personnel. He can send more men to patrol beaches and barns for illicit bails. Or he can improve roads and courts. The blockade demands the former. Over time, you get a bureaucracy optimized to chase merchants, not to raise productivity. The opportunity cost is large and invisible. The road not repaired raises transport costs. The court case delayed raises transaction costs. The tax reform postponed leaves distortions in place. When people talk about welfare loss, this is part of it, resources pulled into guarding the rule rather than creating value. Local discontent feeds back into politics in ways a capital cannot script. City councils send petitions about shortages and price spikes. Merchants complain about arbitrary seizures or inconsistent rulings between neighboring jurisdictions. Guilds argue for exceptions to keep their members employed. Each petition is a data point that enforcement is expensive not only for smugglers but for citizens who try to follow the rules. As these complaints stack up, officials at the center face a dilemma: relax and watch leaks widen, or press harder and watch legitimacy thin. Either choice carries a cost, but pressing harder often deepens the very corruption and grey markets the policy was meant to crush. Look at the map shaded for smuggling intensity and you can see a geography of exhaustion forming. Coastal fringes with tricky inlets show one color. River corridors like the Elbe and the Weserglow with another. Mountain passes and borderlands develop their own microecologies of trade. These are not just hot zones for illegal activity. They are also zones where the population learns that flexibility pays and rigid compliance punishes. Once learned, that lesson does not vanish with a new decree. It becomes a cultural muscle memory that outlasts the blockade. There is also the psychological price of living under ration variety. Variety is not frivolous. It is a signal that supply chains are healthy, that traders are competing, that customers have bargaining power. When shelves thin and choices collapse to a single coarse cloth or a single coarse sweetener, it is not just comfort that shrinks. It is the sense that the world is narrowing and that the rules, not reality, are the cause. That sentiment, multiplied across towns and seasons, erodes compliance more effectively than pamphlets ever could. In the end, the continental welfare costs do not announce themselves with a single statistic. They accumulate in kitchen accounts, workshop logbooks, and municipal budgets. They appear as children who grow up remembering ersatz coffee, as craftsmen who recall the months when a vital input simply vanished, as officials who learned that a policy could be legally correct and economically wrong in the same breath. When those memories pile up, the policy has already lost something precious, the benefit of the doubt. Hold that ledger of losses as we bring the pieces together. If decree raises cost, and cost creates spreads, and spreads summon workarounds, then the next question writes itself. Why did the system fail to deliver the strategic strangulation it promised, and who adapted faster than the law could learn? Let's connect the dots and watch the machine jam itself. Think of the Continental System as a grand lever pulled from the center. The intention is simple: raise the effective cost of trading with Britain so high that commerce stops, revenue dries up, and the island bends the knee. But the economy does not react like a parade ground. It reacts like water. Start with the initial move. A central decree raises trade frictions. Overnight, the cost of touching British goods is higher in money, time, paperwork, and risk. That one push has three immediate effects. First, price gaps appear between British markets and continental markets. Second, volume on legal routes shrinks. Third, information becomes more valuable than ever because knowing which route is open next week can be worth more than a faster ship. Now trace the feedback. Those price gaps are not empty space. They are signals that shout profit. Merchants, shipowners, and insurers swarm toward them with the tools they know: rerouting, relabeling, licensing, parceling cargo, and slipping through microgeographies that the decree cannot patrol. That is the arbitrage response. Every successful run narrows the spread just enough to keep demand alive without erasing the incentive to try again. As arbitrage thickens, a second loop clicks in: rents and corruption. Wherever a stamp, license, or inspection can swing the value of cargo by a large margin, the power to grant that stamp acquires a price. Customs queues turn into marketplaces. Exceptions multiply because exceptions pay. Local officials learn the dance, enforce enough to show zeal, relax enough to keep the town supplied and the budget solvent. In theory, that is disobedience. In practice, it is the equilibrium that keeps roofs over heads. Those two loops, arbitrage and rents, feed a third, political backlash. Households live with ration variety and yo-yo prices. Workshops juggle missing inputs and missed deadlines. Town councils send petitions. Regional administrators plead for exemptions to save employment or calm tempers. The center faces a fork. Tighten enforcement to restore purity, which widens spreads and fattens rents. Or loosen enforcement to reduce pain, which admits more British-linked goods and undermines the strategy's purpose. Either way, the policy's internal contradictions become visible to everyone who has to live with them. Add a fourth loop that is easy to miss: administrative fatigue. Policing a continent's coastline and borderlands is not a single action. It is a grind. Men, money, and attention are finite. Every additional checkpoint, patrol, and court case displaces other tasks that actually raise productivity or legitimacy. Over time, the apparatus built to enforce the decree becomes heavier, costlier, and less effective because it is chasing a moving target: traders who keep learning. Enforcement adapts by adding rules. Traders adapt faster by simplifying incentives to one word: margin. Meanwhile, the adversary is not static. Britain reallocates. Convoys harden schedules. Insurance prices uncertainty so voyages remain bankable. Trade tilts toward imperial lanes and any continental gateway pried open by war or alliance. That external adaptation shortens the life of each tightening cycle on the continent, because every time enforcement makes one corridor costly, another corridor with naval cover looks relatively better. The decree pushes. The enemy pulls. The market flows through the difference. Put it all together and you get the causal loop you see on the slide. Central decree raises effective trade costs. That creates price gaps. Price gaps summon arbitrage and smuggling. Arbitrage and smuggling dilute the policy's impact while feeding a layer of rent-seeking around stamps and licenses. Rents and shortages create political backlash and petition pressure. The center responds with either more rules or more exceptions. More rules raise costs and spreads again, which restarts the arbitrage engine. More exceptions hollow out the strategy from within. At each turn of the wheel, decentralized actors learn a little faster, while the centralized apparatus grows a little heavier. The result is not theatrical failure. It is cumulative deadweight loss. Britain is strained but mobile. Continental economies bear the heavier costs of misallocation, enforcement overhead, and lost trust. The original strategic intent, strangle the enemy's finance, mutates into an unintended subsidy for those best at gaming the system. Smugglers, license brokers, and flexible merchants become the true beneficiaries, while households and rule-following firms pay. Ask the uncomfortable question at the end of this chain. If a policy's success requires perfect compliance across hundreds of jurisdictions, thousands of miles of coast, and millions of daily decisions, is the policy designed for the world that exists, or for the world on a map? The Continental System tells us the answer in ledgers and price sheets. The more the center tried to program outcomes, the more the periphery turned the program into a menu of options. Hold that loop in your mind as we step briefly out of the narrative to talk about how we know what we claim to know. In a story made of spreads, seizures, and substitutions, method matters as much as metaphor. Before we draw conclusions, let's talk about how we know what we think we know. History is not a crystal ball. It is a stack of ledgers, newspapers, court cases, and stubborn gaps. So here is how we keep our footing on uneven ground. First, triangulation. We do not rely on a single price list or a single city's gossip. We cross-check overlapping sources. Merchant price currents from London, Hamburg, and Paris give us commodity quotations week by week. Customs ledgers show declared values and volumes, though they undercount what slips through the cracks. Prize court records tell us which ships were stopped, what they carried, and how judges reasoned about legality. None of these alone is perfect. Together they form a three-legged stool that does not wobble as much. Second, persistence over one-off fireworks. Markets are noisy. A frost, a storm, or a rumor can kick a price for a month. We care less about a single spike and more about spreads that open and stay open through multiple enforcement cycles. If sugar in Hamburg sits above sugar in London for months on end, easing only when smuggling runs grow hot and tightening when patrols return, that pattern matters more than any one market day. Direction and duration beat drama. Third, internal consistency checks. When we see a reported surge in seizures on a particular route, we look for a matching tremor in insurance rates and freight quotes. If underwriters really feared a lane, premiums should rise. If they did not, perhaps the seizure report is partial, political, or simply not big enough to move the dial. Likewise, when a decree widens the list of prohibited goods, we watch for a corresponding change in reported imports through legal exceptions or in the flow of licenses. Words should tug on numbers. If they do not, we interrogate both. Fourth, series strengths and weaknesses. Historical price data can be patchy. A city may miss weeks. Units may shift. Quality grades may vary. We keep a simple rule: do not pretend to more precision than the series offers. When grades differ, we compare trends rather than absolute levels. When a city series goes dark, we do not fill the void with wishful thinking. We flag the hole and rely on neighboring markets to infer the likely path, noting the uncertainty out loud. Fifth, separating positive description from normative judgment. Positive description asks, what happened and how do we know? Normative judgment asks, was it good policy? We keep them apart. The evidence tells us that blockades acted like a moving tax and that spreads invited smuggling. Whether a government should accept those trade-offs is a question for another room. Here, our job is to build the cleanest map we can and let you trace the roads. Sixth, robustness through multiple proxies. Not every effect shows up neatly in prices. Some show up in timing and routing. A sudden growth of traffic through a staging port, a flurry of license issuances in a quarter, a spike in prize litigation, or a burst of petitions from city councils complaining about shortages, these are all proxies for friction that numerical series may understate. When three proxies hum the same note, we listen closely. Seventh, honesty about underreporting. Smuggling by definition resists measurement. Customs men do not tally what they do not see, and smugglers do not publish quarterly results. That means our totals are almost certainly low where the law failed most. Instead of pretending we can fix that with a single correction factor, we lean on patterns that are harder to fake: the persistence of price gaps in inland markets far from ports, the survival of workshops that supposedly lost key inputs, and the rhythmic appearance of seizures that look more like sampling than the whole catch. Eighth, context guards against overreach. If a city's basket of colonial goods thins at the same time a local official reports rising bribe prices for customs seals, and merchants start advertising substitutes in newspapers, we treat that cluster as a credible signal of welfare loss and rent creation. If only one of those lights blinks, we wait before declaring victory for a theory. Finally, open ledgers. We mark where claims come from in broad daylight. Merchant price sheets, customs books, prize court summaries, and modern syntheses all have fingerprints. When we say a spread widened, it is because overlapping sources point the same way. When we say a decree backfired, it is because behavior on the ground nudged around it in ways the numbers and narratives both record. So the method is not mysterious. It is patient. Cross cities, cross sources, emphasize persistence, check proxies, and refuse to be precise where the data is muddy. That is how you keep storytelling from outrunning the evidence. And that is how you respect the people who lived this: merchants, sailors, officials, and households, by letting their ledgers and letters speak in chorus instead of cherry-picking a solo. With our footing set, we can step to the final reflections. What should we carry forward from this saga into our own century, where rules travel faster than sail and prices travel at the speed of light, yet incentives remain deeply human? Prices defy empires. That is the quiet headline of this whole story. You can command a coastline, but you cannot command every transaction, every rumor, every midnight boat. The Continental System teaches a durable lesson: when rules fight incentives, incentives do not surrender. They reroute. So what do we carry forward? First, control is not binary. The continent was never truly closed and Britain was never fully open. Instead, the map became gradients, not borders. The moment a few ports under friendly flags reopened, Lisbon, Cadiz, later selective Russian gateways, the word closed turned into a negotiation. That is the first takeaway for any age: real-world compliance is a spectrum, not a switch. Second, centralized economic war breeds grey markets as predictably as winter breeds ice. Decrees created spreads. Spreads recruited smugglers and license brokers. Those actors did not simply break the rules, they monetised the gaps between them. The more detailed the rules became, the more profitable it was to specialize in the exceptions. That, quietly, explains why some parts of the continent felt poorer while a whole new profession learned to grow rich on stamps and signatures. Third, durable advantage flowed to the side with deeper capital markets and credible finance. Britain's tax system, funded debt, and naval logistics formed a triangle that could absorb shocks. Convoys made risk priceable. Insurance translated fear into a spreadsheet. Investors kept lending because the state kept paying. That is not romance. That is institutional memory at work. Fourth, substitution is powerful but not free. Beet sugar, linen and hemp, North American timber, each substitution came with costs, learning curves, and trade-offs in quality or timing. Some stuck, some faded, many left behind sunk capital and second-best routines that outlived the policy that summoned them. Forced adaptation solves short-term shortages while seeding long-term inefficiencies. You feel both. Fifth, coercion has political half-lives. Scarcity creates not just higher prices but thinner patience. Petitions piled up. Officials chose flexibility over purity to keep towns fed and workshops open. Each local compromise weakened the uniform front the center needed to project. Over time, the Continental System eroded not only trade but trust. Now, the then versus now echo. Modern sanctions move at digital speed. Paper became pixels, sale plans became spreadsheets, and financial plumbing runs through instant settlement rails. Yet notice the rhyme. Today, as then, you see price gaps open, routing change, insurance and freight adjust, and a grey ecosystem rise to sell navigation through the rules. The metrics that diagnosed leakage in 1812 still diagnose leakage now: persistent price dispersion across markets that should converge, sudden traffic growth through staging hubs, spikes in freight and insurance premia on certain lanes, flurries of exemptions and licenses that quietly turn prohibitions into toll roads. Different century, same incentives. So what should we watch if we want to know whether a control regime is working or leaking? Start with 4 simple indicators. 1. Price gaps that stay wide even after a policy honeymoon ends. 2. Routing changes that do not reverse when the news cycle moves on. 3. Administrative behavior that tells on itself, surges in exemptions, rising fees for compliance, crowded courts. 4. The rise of specialist intermediaries who make a living not by producing goods, but by producing access. When those lights are all blinking, the policy is sponsoring its own workaround. And the moral question underneath the graphs? The stronger your plan relies on perfect obedience, the more fragile your plan becomes. Markets reward options, entrepreneurship, and credible promises more than they reward edicts. That is not ideology. That is the record we just walked through: ledgers, letters, price sheets, convoy lists. We will end with 2 open questions for you to carry out of this episode. How should a society measure the true cost of economic warfare when the pain lands in kitchens and workshops rather than only on balance sheets? And how can modern states design controls that target specific harms without training an entire industry to sell the loopholes? Those are not academic puzzles. They are live wires in our own century. If this exploration sharpened how you see the past and the present, I would love to keep the conversation going. Please like, comment, and subscribe to help more viewers find thoughtful history told with real evidence and real personality. And if you want to dive deeper, check out my book, History They Tried to Erase, linked in the description. There is a lot more where this came from. Explore the channel for more episodes if you enjoy history that teaches, surprises, and entertains.